A fill-in-the-bubble education for urban students, a study in standardized testing, by Rebecca Urey, Winnie Coco, Julianne McGovern, Danielle Peliquin, and Reagan Urbanek.
First signed in 1965, the ESEA focused on providing additional school funding to schools with large numbers of students living in poverty. President Johnson believed that a full educational opportunity should be our first national goal. The bill aimed to shorten the achievement gap between students by providing each student with fair and equal educational opportunities. The act authorized funds for professional development and instructional materials. The ESEA was reauthorized by George W. Bush and became the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001, followed by Obama's reauthorization in 2015 as the Every Student Succeeds Act. Policymakers and educators have long looked at the disparity between the achievement scores of white students versus students of color, primarily African American students. In 1967, Coleman presented his view of the educational opportunities available to white as well as African American students. In a 1960s view, Coleman explains that the true equality in such opportunities can only exist if all out-of-school influences remain equal. Since that was unlikely to happen in the predominantly lower-class Negro family environments, the school needed to offset the negative or divergent effects of the home. A Nation at Risk, the groundbreaking report of the Reagan administration, sought to shock the country into doing something about the failing educational achievements of the United States students during the last decade of the Cold War. The commission responsible for the report took a different approach than Coleman 20 years earlier. We needed to make sure we kept up with our allies, and more importantly, our adversaries, and in many cases, young people themselves were to blame. Thus began the emphasis on ensuring we schooled students to make us look good rather than to help them live happy and successful lives. President Bush's No Child Left Behind Act raised public consciousness of the importance of standards-based instruction. This is in large part due to the belief that the standards movement calls for more intellectually demanding content and pedagogy. This belief, coupled with the nation's desire for increased accountability, led to widespread standardized testing. After all, one of the primary purposes of NCLB was the reduction of achievement gaps. NCLB's accountability requirements resulted in consequences for schools that continually failed to improve student learning. The most controversial consequence of failure to improve is a reduction in funding. Because of this consequence and school districts' need of government funding, schools are working harder than ever to increase student achievement on state-mandated tests. To increase achievement, states have adopted standards that focus on the core academic subjects of reading, math, and science. The Every Student Succeeds Act, signed by President Obama in 2015, reduces some of the most strangling regulations of No Child Left Behind and leaves more control to state boards of education. However, with the recent change in administration, the future of standardized reform is still unclear for urban education.
Although standardized testing has been around for more than a century, the development and implementation of Common Core state standards was said to be a game changer. The standards, meant to raise expectations with the goal of every child being college or career ready by the time of his or her high school graduation, were hailed by some as the answer to the United States' falling scores on international assessments, as well as reports from post-secondary institutions that students were not prepared for college-level work. Others, however, decried the standards as being federal interference with what they thought should be under state and local control. Still, while arguing for rigor, the standards sought to give teachers more freedom in what they taught, as long as they sought to teach the standards. Early appreciation had some teachers seeing this as the way to embed authentic learning. Instead, school districts have sought to meet these standards with prescribed curricula, standard district assessments, and increased numbers of nationally normed standardized tests, many of which are multiple choice because they can be easily scored before moving on to the next unit. This video, which surfaced in 2012 as Common Core picked up steam, promised the new standards would eliminate the kinds of job applicants seen in this segment, ones who cannot think on their own. Unfortunately, we've succeeded in perpetuating the very problem we set out to correct.
Hello. Welcome to Energy Conservation Incorporated.
Thank you. I really hope to get a job here.
Well, let's get started with your interview. What do you think are your greatest strengths?
My greatest strengths.
Yes, your greatest strengths.
What are my answer choices?
What do you mean?
My answer choices. You know, A, B, C, or D.
There are not any answer choices.
Oh, I understand. In that case, I choose C.
You choose C?
Yes, I choose C. My 5th grade teacher told me to always choose C when I did not know the answer.
Oh, it sounds like your 5th grade teacher really prepared you for your future.
Although numbers for the total number of students enrolled in urban public schools nationwide are difficult to compile, the statistics highlighted here for 3 school districts in large urban areas illustrate the typical makeup of such schools. In each case, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, white students make up the minority of those enrolled in the public schools. In Los Angeles, however, the percentage of white students only slightly outpaces the percentage of African American students. But in each district, students of color far outnumber white students, and the poverty levels remain high. In addition, only Los Angeles seems to do a good job balancing the race and ethnicities of its teachers with those of its students. Just 34% of teachers are white, while in Chicago and New York the numbers are 51% and 59% respectively. It is important to remember that the racial disparities here are indicative of a greater problem. These numbers provide context for the environment in which educators work and students learn. While differences in class, home structure, and language might account for some disparities in the rates of educational success, they are not enough to explain away the difference. As a result, the role of school factors, from administrators to teachers and instruction, must be recognized in student achievement. Additionally, in many areas, school funds come in large part from property taxes. If a district has at least 3/4 of its population living in poverty, it will have far fewer resources available to it than those schools situated in more affluent areas. This is part of what Ladson-Billings calls the education debt. Rather than focusing on the achievement gap, which we'll explain later, the differences in the educational success rates between students of color and their white counterparts are due to centuries of marginalization. Rising from the values of colonial society, which allocated rights to only white male landowners, this has resulted in endemic racism and segregation in work, home, and school, to such an extent that we must make systemic changes if we ever hope to help urban students reach higher rates of academic success.
Before we go further, we need to cite some definitions. What is standard-based education? How is testing implemented? What is the achievement gap? And what role does a prescribed curriculum play? Standards-based education, while gaining momentum in the 1990s, began in earnest with the 2002 No Child Left Behind Act. Standards-based education focuses on content standards, or what skills and knowledge students at a particular grade level must gain. In theory, this is a good idea. In 1999, Marzano wrote about the need for standards after instructional chaos in many schools where teachers might have had curriculum maps, but no guide to the actual skills they needed to teach. He quotes Rosenhalt's view that the hallmark of any successful organization is a shared sense among its members of what they are trying to accomplish. At that time, however, Marzano was advising common sense standards, making sure instruction was deep and meaningful, not widespread and shallow. In other words, an inch wide and a mile deep, not the other way around. You cannot teach all the standards, but Marzano did advise starting with the standards tested on state assessments. If we have standards and we want to see how well students are meeting them, then the tests need to be standardized as well. Many people are familiar with the New York Board of Regents examinations, Iowa tests of basic skills, measure of academic progress or MAP, and STAR testing in many content areas. More recently, schools in states which adopted the Common Core take either the PARCC or Smarter Balance assessments. Many districts take combinations of these nationally normed tests, which tell federal and local agencies, local school districts, and the public how well a school, and sometimes how well an individual teacher, is educating students. The achievement gap refers to disparities in educational outcomes, particularly as related to various measures of success, such as scores on achievement tests, dropout rates, and overall educational attainment. The National Center for Education Statistics defines it as occurring when one group of students, such as students grouped by race, ethnicity, or gender, outperforms another group, and the difference in average scores for the two groups is statistically significant. This generally means the standardized test scores of various subgroups of students of color and those from low-income households are ranked against those of white or Asian American, mostly middle-class students. Not only are student scores compared within schools, but also across school districts, states, and the country. Although contemporary standardized tests have been in use for decades and the achievement gap has been officially recognized since the 1970s, not much progress has occurred. The prescribed curriculum comes from the idea that teachers must teach the same content in the same way to all students to reach achievement goals. This scripted, prepackaged curricula is generally doled out to inexperienced or underprepared teachers as a means to help them know what, when, and how to teach. Unfortunately, urban schools are often heavily populated with underprepared teachers. As a result, students in these environments experience scripted, narrowed curriculum more often than not. This is a problem for several reasons, but the main issue is that scripted and predetermined curriculum essentially robs students from engaging with other disciplines that may allow students to develop creativity and build skills in other content areas. Students in urban schools suffer most from the lack of exposure to a more broad and sophisticated curriculum.
After reviewing the literature regarding standardized testing and its relationship with urban education, we came upon three important themes. First, standardized testing inappropriately allocates numbers and figures to a conceptual phenomenon that is grounded in democratic values. Here, we can trace the history of education back to Dewey and Thomas Jefferson, who both commented on the need for education to help perpetuate democracy and create well-educated citizens. Of course, schooling was redefined during the Industrial Revolution to produce a labor force that could take orders and act as another cog in the overall wheel. Since then, we've tried to get away from this mentality and embrace an educational platform that encouraged cognitive growth as well as emotional and social growth. Standardized testing disregards the various kinds of growth in order to quantify learning. This is most problematic for urban students because it reinforces the idea that they are just a mass and not individuals. By attributing numbers and scores to student achievement, the voices of urban students are being silenced. This is just one more instance in a pattern of neglect in regards to this demographic. The second theme, standardized testing exacerbates past and current racism while reinforcing the importance of cultural and economic capital. According to Anderson, standardized testing not only perpetuates racism, but it has ushered in a new generation of discrimination that disaggregates test scores by race as well as class. But the fact of the matter is that in 1966, James Coleman looked into this issue and delivered a report on the equality of educational opportunity. In his report, which was given to the President, House, and Senate, he explained that various racial and ethnic groups are at a disadvantage in regards to testing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the impetus behind this study, and it was found that schools with a large minority population had fewer resources and performed worse on tests than white students from more advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. Standardized testing negates the profession of teaching by constraining teacher autonomy and harming the student-teacher relationship. This is our third theme. Student-centered learning has become the new norm on college campuses, and such teaching methods are being integrated into primary and secondary schools. However, teacher-centered learning is favored in urban classrooms, where teachers are more likely to be underqualified or not as knowledgeable or comfortable with more progressive pedagogies. Additionally, standardized tests support teacher-centered learning because they both rely on passivity and an absence of active learning. Not only is that detrimental for primary and secondary students in urban schools, but it also sets them up to fail in college, where they will be expected to think critically, investigate norms, and creatively problem solve. Thus, this educational structure not only prescribes what the teacher must teach, but it also sets the students up to fail by passively feeding them the information or answers. As previously mentioned, standardized testing takes a conceptual or philosophical discipline and tries to quantify it by attributing numbers and scores to student achievement. I use this phrase ironically to show that these kinds of tests are not actually an assessment of student achievement. We will get into this later on in our presentation. On the very surface level, obsession over testing and its subsequent scoring removes education from its foundational questions and goals, which are to integrate students into a well-educated society. This kind of structure is in direct conflict with democratic values which espouse that education is open and equal for all, and is governed by the voice and value of the collective people. Standardized testing undermines democracy in education because the creation, implementation, and scoring of these tests relies on only a few people who dictate the decision for all. Urban students are even more vulnerable to this because of their age and lack of political power due to their class. This is one of the instances in a long trend in which these students and their communities are silenced. Another educational value is a student's ability to think critically and integrate knowledge from various experiences into their scholastic studies. The implementation of standardized testing discourages innovation, risk-taking, creativity, and higher-order thinking. In fact, it perpetuates a fear of failure and/or a perception that failure is shameful. Overall, this creates a culture of fear in urban education within a population that is already fearful and skeptical of education. Under this system, teachers and education in general are the enemy because they deliver failure. Though these tests do not prove if the student is college ready, test scores can certainly deter students from seeking higher education. Wealthier students have access to counseling through a school guidance counselor if they are despondent regarding their test scores. Such resources are often unavailable to urban students. Thus, when urban students receive their test scores, they may believe that the arbitrary numbers are a predictor of their personal and academic success. While schools are supposed to foster an emotional relationship between the student and his or her education, which can support the student's cognitive and emotional growth, standardized tests create an overwhelming amount of anxiety and distance the student from such growth. Price's research from 2010 concluded that cultural capital surpasses all other factors relating to public school success. Schools with a culture of unity do better on tests because the culture of education can be passed down over a period of time. Urban students do not have this luxury because their housing and education is oftentimes more transient and does not allow them to ingrain themselves in a school. Community and family stability also have an impact on testing, but this impact is not explicitly recorded on the test. Even the way the students are tasked with studying for the test is ineffective and counterintuitive to what education claims itself to be. Instead of engaging with topics, students are encouraged to cram, memorize, and regurgitate information without analysis. Such rote practices remove knowledge from its cultural context, which further confuses urban students who are already uncomfortable with education and skeptical of its usefulness to their everyday lives. A side effect is that standardized testing implicitly promotes boredom. Mora found that boredom is positively correlated with book-driven curricula. Students become frustrated when lessons do not relate to their academic and personal lives. Frustrated students lead to frustrated teachers, who are more likely to view rebellious students as acting out or in defiance. Urban students are more likely to act out because they are not given the resources or power to create change. Acting out leads to punishment, which leads to a loss of interest in education. Of course, it's not just the boredom over preparation for the formal tests that plague students, but also the practice tests and pre-practice tests that students are subjected to in order to ensure that they perform well. The first issue we want to call attention to is the belief that standardized testing can shed light on or confront inequalities. While this is true, it's a bit naive to assume that society is unaware of the inequalities within education. As previously stated, the Coleman Report was issued over 50 years ago and drew many of the same conclusions about the urban students' achievement on high-stakes testing as contemporary research has proven. Personally, I believe that all stakeholders know that there is an issue. We don't need standardized tests to prove that to us. Other proponents of standardized testing have said that the removal of standardized tests will not get rid of the political and social issues that are plaguing education. This may be true, but copious amounts of research has proven that high-stakes testing is doing more harm than good, both academically and emotionally. In fact, the case can be made that urban students are subjected to even greater negative emotional and social effects of testing because the urban schools do not have the resources to offer such support. Counseling services are already overtasked with numerous issues that wealthier schools are not privy to. Additionally, the detrimental emotional and social impact is not limited to the students, but is also felt by the teachers. In fact, certain suburban communities that have high parental influence have removed some standardized testing because the parents find it to be unhealthy. Most urban communities do not have that level of parental advocacy, so the testing remains despite its known hazards. Thus, standardized tests are more prevalent in low-income communities where students are taught to be docile and forego creativity and critical thinking for standardization and conformity. Urban students are more likely to view high-stakes testing as just another obstacle that they need to overcome, just like all of the other barriers that are placed between them in their attainment of education. The option of relocating to another school or school district is out of the question, as those with high scores are known to push out students who are not high achieving in order to keep their status. It is here that scholars say we are creating a new kind of discrimination, in which lower performing students are barred from quote-unquote good schools because they will bring down the test average. In addition to this new kind of discrimination, standardized tests still perpetuate the racist belief that there's a correlation between intelligence and race. I want to take a moment to look at this idea of discrimination based upon test performance. Firstly, the tests do not take into consideration the resources that schools, teachers, and students have. Instead, the focus is placed entirely on the output, the score. This is problematic because a school with no resources that performs modestly is actually outperforming a school with numerous resources that performs as expected. Without equality in resources, it is impossible to assess achievement and performance. Secondly, tests make the child accountable to the state, but the state is not held accountable to the child to provide adequate educational resources. In fact, the state will remove funding, and thus resources, if the child does not perform. If the school wants to use the test scores as a way to improve their school, it is nearly impossible to do so because there is little data collected besides which schools performed well and which did not. There is no inclusion of data regarding cause and effects or contributing factors to certain test scores. Thirdly, and lastly, the physical design, implementation, and choice of questions has proven to be biased as it places emphasis on middle to upper middle class questions. Such reading comprehension and vocabulary questions relate to middle or upper middle class language and lifestyle that would be lost on an urban or lower socioeconomic demographic. For example, a student may be asked to choose the word that best relates to the word pants. The options are chairs, telephones, shoes, trousers. While the correct answer is trousers because it is a synonym of pants, students from more disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to choose shoes because they view it as something that is worn, just like pants. They may disregard trousers entirely because it's not part of their everyday vocabulary or lifestyle. The last theme, and the one that resonates the most with us as educators, is standardized testing's way of negating the profession of teaching. It is common knowledge that high-stakes testing narrows and impoverishes the curriculum, which is already strained in urban schools. But what has not been discussed at length is how standardized testing removes school and teacher autonomy by limiting their role in the classroom. The pedagogy is dictated, which is, of course, not inclusive, but it also promotes top-down management that refutes collaboration and shared learning, two pillars of best practices in education. In some urban institutions, test scores are used as a way to surveil the population and normalize or control certain demographics. This has created an exodus of teachers from urban schools where they feel that they are being monitored or judged. More active and creative teachers leave low-performing schools in order to gain more autonomy elsewhere. Teachers with strong backgrounds in education have more options than those who are just starting out or who have already quote-unquote checked out of the profession. While there are exceptions, many of these teachers are left at low-performing schools where they perpetuate the cycle. Why are teachers not as motivated? Well, they're not being evaluated on educational goals or student learning. Instead, they're being judged based upon how well a student passed a test and how effective their test prep was. Standardized testing is not the only standard that teachers must meet. Some districts dictate project-based teaching, which is in direct opposition to high-stakes testing. Of course, teachers at urban schools have the added pressure of acting as counselors, security guards, and academic coaches, among other hats that they must wear. The juggling of these roles is typically not acknowledged or supported by administration, which breeds resentment and frustration. The only way to break out of this cycle is to produce good test scores. Teachers who had good test scores were given more power, freedom, and privilege by their administrators. However, this created political tensions within the schools as colleagues fight for the top spot. Parents become involved by requesting certain teachers who are known to have high-performing classrooms, thus furthering this discrimination not just by district and school, but also by class. All of this has a negative impact on the most vital relationship, that between the teacher and the student. Arguably, this relationship is even more important in urban schools where students reach out to teachers for guidance, mentoring, or to be role models.
When Congress debated the value of No Child Left Behind in 2001, skeptics noted that its accountability mandates and consequences for test results could lead to teaching to the test. Supporters rebutted those concerns with, if it's a good test, teach to it. In all areas of the country, the emphasis on meeting standards, whether they be Common Core or other newly designed state standards, can lead to a downward spiral that defeats the very purpose of the expectations. But while suburban and rural schools experience their share of frustration with the emphasis on standardized testing and prescribed curricula, nowhere is the reality of these mandates more evident than in urban schools. One study estimates students spend 100 hours of instructional time on test prep alone, just to make sure they score high on a battery of annual standardized tests. In 1916, Dewey asked, why is it, in spite of the fact that teaching by pouring in, learning by passive absorption are universally condemned, that they are so entrenched in practice? A century later, we are still asking that question. An adage says you can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. Yet that is exactly what the current movement of accountability asks us to do. So what does it mean to teach to the test? In simplest terms, it means instructing students with a uniform curriculum, requiring classroom teachers in the same grade or subject to teach the same things for the same length of time, often on the same days, using the same materials, and all for the purpose of raising scores on high-stakes tests. Let's look at this scenario a little more closely, especially in terms of urban students. Title I gives money to schools with high numbers of low-income families, and No Child Left Behind required schools receiving such funds to use scripted curriculum because it's the only scientifically based method to help students meet standards. Additionally, scripted curriculum helps to ensure every teacher can deliver the same content, something especially important because of the increasing numbers coming to the profession in non-traditional ways. Fast-track certification programs, such as those offered by Teach for America, as well as by colleges across the country, often leave their pre-service teachers without the nuts and bolts needed to effectively instruct. Although Teach for America, or TFA, does have effective components to it, let's use it as an example. Urban schools employ a high number of TFA fellows, thereby increasing the use of scripted curricula. TFA's effectiveness is mixed, meaning schools do not necessarily show the gains imagined by TFA's founder, Wendy Kopp. Additionally, only a slight majority of TFA fellows remain in teaching after their 2-year commitment, thus exposing urban schools to the revolving door of teachers, meaning more teachers with less training using scripted curricula, and the cycle continues. Scripted curricula also means students receiving this kind of instruction are often shortchanged lessons in social studies, science, physical education, world language, or the arts because the big tests don't cover those areas. The emphasis is then put on math and English instruction. Yet instruction in those areas left out actually allows students to better develop reading, critical thinking, and creative skills via a multitude of disciplines and interest areas. In addition, Milner cites Banks' assertion that, quote, the world's greatest problems do not result from people being unable to read and write. They result in people in the world, from different cultures, races, religions, and nations, being unable to get along and work together to solve the world's intractable problems, such as global warming, the AIDS epidemic, poverty, racism, sexism, and war. A prescribed curriculum, one that boasts the same materials for use anywhere in the country, puts urban students at particular risk. Recall that urban schools host a majority of population of students of color and low socioeconomic status. And unlike those in more affluent schools, urban students often do not have the social, financial, or emotional access to enrichment activities to account for the gap in learning from different subject areas. But more than this, scripted curricula and standardized tests negate students' backgrounds and cultural capital, not to mention the realities of their lives. When students do not make the grade on standardized tests, teachers often make excuses, blaming the student's background, family life, language, or work ethic for the lack of success. Yet Gregory, Skiba, and Nagura say there is no evidence to suggest demographic factors are in any way sufficient to explain away the gap. Teacher and school factors need to be considered. Those teacher factors include a deficit perspective, which discounts a student's lived experiences because they do not adhere to the norms established by the white majority. These norms range from behavior to the schema needed to relate to a learning activity. Additionally, when a student feels respected by a teacher or the school, he or she is more likely to feel good about giving a best effort. By its very nature, a uniform scripted curriculum does not consider individual cultures or needs. Indeed, white students have seen their own culture depicted in school since before the dawn of this country. Everything comes from the majoritarian white perspective. But when students see themselves and their interests reflected in the curriculum, they become more connected to the school, the teacher, and each other. Delpit reminds us that it's not just about teaching what interests students, but to find the interests of the students and build an academic program around them. Furthermore, the absence of a culturally connected curriculum constitutes the school's null curriculum, which further designates students of color as that of other. Eisner continues by saying this void does not occupy neutral ground. Rather, it has important effects on the kinds of options one is able to consider, the alternatives one can examine, and the perspectives from which one can view a situation or problems. In this case, leaving out completely the history and perspectives of students of color.
So if you look at the statistics that we provided earlier, it shows that a lot of minority students, especially the African Americans, the Hispanic, and the Latino, are found in urban schools or urban centers, and very few of white students are found in those schools. So in order to understand their lives and how they learn and respond to the curriculum, Ford and Moore 2013 explained that no one variable is responsible for explaining this underachievement or the gap that is observed between these schools and the more affluent schools found in the suburbs. And therefore, educators must recognize these variables and work to improve the outcomes of the students. And the solutions must address the contributing social, educational, and cultural or familial factors which should match the problems that the students have. So it emerged from the themes that teacher preparation programs need to revamp the way they prepare teachers to come and work with students in the urban centers. So it includes teaching them the cultural perspective of the minority students in the urban centers and understanding their way of life so that the teachers are able to work with them well once they get into the job or once they train and they start working with kids in urban centers. Again, they must understand the historical and cultural perspectives of the students. And what this helps with is that the teachers are able to put themselves in the shoes of the students and understand why the students are behaving the way they do. So many times, if the teachers are not affluent with the historical and the cultural perspectives of the students, they may not be able to relate to what the students want or the students' needs. And in that manner, they might not be giving effective pedagogy that the students can benefit from. And then again, teachers need to develop a new thinking about urban education. There's this stereotype thinking that students who go to urban schools are not bright enough, they are intellectually inferior, and they cannot relate to the curriculum and things like that. And teachers have taken this and internalized it, and they actually think that students who are in urban schools cannot achieve. So they need to have a new kind of thinking that puts aside the deficit kind of thinking. And this involves encouraging the students to participate in class and not letting the students fail. And then again, sometimes other authors suggest using a social justice philosophy approach that ensures free, appropriate, equitable, and culturally responsive education, as well as the critical race theory. And then the other solution that they provide is reforming testing policies and practices and allow students to make their own goals so that they are able to relate more to whatever they're doing. And then again, some authors advise teachers to have interesting short-term academic goals that the students can find more interesting rather than having long-term goals that are geared towards standardized testing. So in as much as the ultimate goal is for the students to pass standardized testing, there's a need for teachers to make those goals really short so that students can only take in a little bit at a time so that they don't get bored and they don't give up along the way. And then again, other authors advise relational teaching, and this involves teachers having a personal relationship with the students. Not personal per se, because they still have to be professional, but just the aspect of knowing the student more in depth, so that they're able to trust you and they're able to learn from you. And according to one of the studies, relational teaching has been linked to proficiency on standardized tests and improved quality of education. So, in a nutshell, these solutions are really good and they can help teachers to work well with students in urban centers. And if applied with fidelity, they can actually work.
Historically, prescribed and mandated curricula were meant to improve standardized testing. Initially, these tests were used for accountability and to ensure all students, especially urban ones, were meeting adequate yearly growth as prescribed by No Child Left Behind. However, the intense dependence on prescribed curricula and standardized testing predates No Child Left Behind and started with LBJ in the 1960s. Over the last 5 decades, there has been a bipartisan approach to interfering with education policy to the point that it has created extreme pressures on teachers to teach to the test rather than teaching students to think deeply and critically. Unfortunately, these mandates have only served to dehumanize the education process for teachers and students alike, as Delpit and White-Bradley report that many urban students feel oppressed by the very prison-like system that should be opening doors of discovery and opportunity. For example, in one large school system in North Carolina, at urban schools, teachers must call for security to come and escort students to the restroom in order to maintain control. But that is not the policy in the suburban parts of the district. These inequitable policies only serve to perpetuate rigid control of the students and what is taught and learned rather than implementing a liberating and democratic curriculum and procedures. The end results of high-stakes testing and the dependence on prescribed curricula is that many teachers feel that they are treated unprofessionally. Low teacher morale has led to much higher teacher turnover rates in urban schools than suburban ones. Therefore, students in urban schools are too often left with inexperienced teachers and constant instability as opposed to feeling as if they are part of a community. Students of color are further alienated when prescribed curricula do not reflect them except for a passing glance on a special occasion or during Black History Month. The lack of emphasis on democratic teaching practices and culturally responsive teaching further contributes to the feelings of imprisonment. The potential solutions are vast. One area that may hold the greatest promise is relational teaching. Knowing the students, providing autonomy, and allowing student choice could offer solutions that humanize the education process again and provide opportunities to model democratic practices. Looking at innovation in education that focus on relational teaching, autonomy, and choice may be manageable and affordable ways to effect change in urban schools. These areas definitely need further study. Moving forward, there are many avenues that need to be explored. First, a focus on deep learning rather than teaching to a test is a desperate need. Therefore, one question is how can teachers promote deep learning and critical thinking rather than the pursuit of a test score? Another question regards innovation to creating student-centered rather than testing-centered classrooms. What would a truly student-centered classroom look like? How can we create that kind of environment given budgetary limits and accountability issues? Finally, politics and its impact on policies must be addressed. It is not easy since everyone has had some sort of schooling. Therefore, managing different political beliefs and how those play out in the public education system has historically resulted in some schools and students receiving a disproportionate amount of the resources. Perhaps the question should be, can public schooling management become an independent agency within the government versus one managed by an elected official's appointee? There are other independent agencies and perhaps more continuity with a focus on solutions-based research could be a viable option.